Good morning, Dan and Amy. So on Friday, the reaction to the failure to cobble together the 218 that Speaker Paul Ryan needed to call the question and move Obamacare replacement to the Senate. This is what Paul Ryan had to say about that, and Nancy Pelosi as well.
Obamacare is the law of the land. It's going to remain the law of the land until it's replaced. We did not have quite the votes to replace this law. And so, we're going to be living with Obamacare for the foreseeable future.
It's pretty exciting for us. Yesterday, our anniversary. Today, a victory for the Affordable Care Act, more importantly, for the American people.
If Nancy Pelosi is declaring victory, that means you're losing if you're on the Republican side. And President Trump responded initially by engaging in a little bit of the blame game, the Freedom Caucus and conservative organizations like Heritage Foundation who opposed the replacement bill, and then got to his Norman Vincent Peale, where he talked optimistically about down the road, not just that the Democrats own Obamacare, whatever happens, but down the road, perhaps this will be the preface to an even better piece of legislation, which is sort of what National Review is suggesting in their Reboot editorial today. And for more on that, we're pleased to be joined by the editor of National Review. He is Rich Lowry. Rich, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
First of all, before we get to that, I want to extend condolences on the passing of Linda Bridges. For those who don't know, she was Bill Buckley's partner in so much of his scholarship. She also was quite the scholar herself. When I was on another station, we had her on the show a few years back when she released Athwart History, a collection of Buckley's works as well. And so very sorry to hear of her passing.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we've lost a great friend and colleague and someone who is just an incredible storehouse of institutional knowledge about National Review. So I appreciate that.
Well, on to the matter at hand, the opening line of your editorial today. Debacle doesn't have to be the last word on Republican efforts to repeal and replace Obamacare. It seems like that is the posture of many Freedom Caucus members, including Jim Jordan over the weekend, but not necessarily the White House.
Yeah, not necessarily the White House, the House, or the Senate, which is a problem. We just don't think you can promise something for 7 years straight and then give up after 3 lackluster weeks. They need to keep after this, not just with Tom Price administratively at the Department of HHS, but they need to try legislatively again. And there'll be a window of reconciliation next year if they don't have an appetite to get right back after it. But they just can't shrug and say, oh, well, after less than a month of trying.
So healthcare is on hold for now, but you say for another year until they go at it again?
Yeah, well, a huge problem here that people sometimes don't appreciate is that when Democrats did all that initial legislating when Obama was elected, Dodd-Frank, Obamacare, the stimulus, they had 60 votes in the Senate. Mm-hmm. And that pretty much gives you close to a rubber stamp. Republicans have 52. So unless they're going to eliminate the legislative filibuster, which Mitch McConnell seems to have no appetite for, they need to bypass it. And the only way you can bypass it on legislation is the so-called reconciliation process, which is associated with the budget process, which means you can do it once a year. You get this window of reconciliation. Now, through some technicalities, they have 2 windows this year, and that's why their plan was to do Obamacare and now to do tax reform, both through reconciliation, so you could pass legislation with just 51 votes. But that's why the bill didn't make a lot of sense, by the way, because supposedly you can't repeal regulations through reconciliation, and regulations were the heart of Obamacare. So that's why you got this really ungainly legislative device that Paul Ryan came up with that a lot of people thought, rightly, would actually make the individual health care market worse rather than better.
But so you have some critics of the Trump-Ryan proposal suggesting what happened here is that procedure dictated policy, and that's a problem because of, as you were just mentioning, kind of the 3 phases that have been much discussed. But isn't...
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
But procedure is part of the reality on the ground, isn't it? I mean, I understand the criticism, but as you were pointing out with the numbers in the Senate, the process really is something that has to be contemplated in figuring out what's the best that you can get.
That's true, certainly true. But I would have started in the House with something they could be proud of. That was a cogent, internally consistent piece of legislation, and they didn't, because they had an eye to Senate procedure. So they came out with this ungainly compromise of a compromise that pleased no one, and that's a formula for not getting it through the House. I thought there was some chance they could still get it through the House just through muscle, which is what they tried to do, but they obviously failed miserably, and now we're nowhere. So I think it would have made more sense to produce something that was defensible on policy grounds, and then let the Senate worry about the procedure. And I think that the Senate, you can probably be more aggressive and creative about what fits under reconciliation. But this is all Monday morning quarterbacking now. That they're moving on to tax reform.
Right, but did it give you pause, though, when on Friday President Trump blamed the Democrats? I mean, how can he blame the Democrats when the Republicans control both the House and Senate?
No, that's true. It's easier if you can do things in a bipartisan way, but this was legislation Democrats never, ever in any universe were going to support. And there's been some loose talk on the Sunday shows over the weekend of Trump reaching out to Democrats, but I think that's hard now. It would have been easier right after his inauguration if he struck a more unifying note in that inaugural address, and then had Chuck Schumer to the White House and say, "Look, Chuck, I'm not letting you leave until we agree on an infrastructure package." And then roll Paul Ryan and say, "Look, I'm the newly elected Republican president. I have this agreement with Chuck Schumer. You're bringing it up on the House, and you're voting for it." And that would have been an entirely different path. It's one he didn't take. Instead, he called Chuck Schumer a clown, repeatedly on Twitter, and mocked him for supposedly fake tears, and went with health care first. And it's just going to make it really hard for him to reverse course and try to start in a more bipartisan way.
Of course, all the headlines this weekend are unsurprisingly, can the GOP govern? All the criticisms of the GOP's inability to govern as indicated by this failure. Is it too soon to start asking that question in a bit of a nervous tone, or are we, one more failure or internal conflict like over tax reform away from that being a legitimate discussion topic?
This is a big step towards that being the reality. Now, tax reform, if they actually were to get tax reform through, especially if they were going to get it through by August, as Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, is promising, that would be a big deal. But if I were them, I'd be tempted to go smaller rather than bigger, because tax reform itself is hideously complex. There are all sorts of painful trade-offs where every action has a reaction. Everything you do is going to upset someone. And I'd be tempted just to do a corporate tax reform where you could get some Democrat votes for that. It's the thing that economists think in the tax code would have the biggest economic benefit, rather than trying something gargantuan and hideously complicated again. And if the tax reform goes down, then the first year legislatively has been a complete failure, and you have some chance of a breach between Congress that's become a really enduring party. And I wouldn't be surprised in that circumstance if Trump might execute kind of a mini Schwarzenegger, because Arnold Schwarzenegger, before he was a failed host of Celebrity Apprentice, was governor of California, won as a populist conservative reformer, realized that was much harder than he realized, and basically turned to the other side and became a Democrat. And I wouldn't expect Trump to go that far, but I think it could be herald a turn to the non-ideological team within his White House, Gary Cohn and Jared Kushner and Ivanka.
That would be.
I could have a lot of people bowling over at the White House.
Well, see, a lot of people getting bowled over. So a couple things. In the short term, Neil Gorsuch can't get confirmed soon enough to kind of break this up, I suppose. But in addition to tax reform, and maybe, as you suggest, starting small before you go big, what about an immigration, particularly as these stories continue from the rape in Maryland of that 14-year-old girl to this story out of New York about a MS-13 gang member deported 4 times who sexually assaulted a 2-year-old and stabbed 2 women. This is obviously a predator that shouldn't be in this country and shouldn't be walking around free in any country, and yet he's back in America for the 5th time. It seems like that is an area, sanctuary city designations, the funding associated with that, that is an area, it seems, where Trump could ply his populism to great political benefit.
Yeah, well, they've already tightened up the enforcement, appropriately so, and that's very easy, relatively. All you need to do is enforce the laws, and you can do that on your own. Congress doesn't have to have anything to do with it, and that's important. And stopping these idiocies like catch and release, and repeatedly sending people back into our society who shouldn't be here in the first place and have committed crimes, I mean, is obviously absurd and has to end. But then if you really want a durable enforcement system, you need to get legislation. And one way to go, and this is potentially something that would have some bipartisan appeal, would be to take the DACA, which is the unilateral action President Obama took to give dreamers, so-called dreamers, a semi-amnesty, and say, Democrats, look, we want to pass that legislatively, write it into law in exchange for an E-Verify system, which would be mandatory for all employers to ensure that they're not hiring illegal labor. Now, that would be a trade-off that potentially could be appealing to Democrats and would actually create an enforcement system where you can envision, 2 or 3 years from now, if it's actually up and running and working, where you could imagine a broader, more comprehensive deal on immigration.
All right. He is Rich Lowry, the editor of National Review, nationalreview.com, and Fox News contributor, also the author of the book Lincoln Unbound. Rich, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me. Have a great morning.
You too.
Yeah, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.